My MIL faked Alzheimer's when confronted, demanding forgiveness for things she couldn't remember. My mother-in-law Barbara stole $47,000 from us over 3 years. When we confronted her with bank statements, receipts, and surveillance footage, she suddenly developed Alzheimer's. I don't remember any of that, she said, clutching her head. Oh God, is this how it starts? Just like my mother? Her performance was Oscar-worthy. Trembling hands, confused blinking, looking around our living room like she'd never seen it before. Where am I? James, is that you? You look so much older. My husband James went white. His grandmother had died of Alzheimer's when he was 15. It was his greatest fear, watching Barbara fade the same way. Mom? He dropped the bank statements. Mom, do you know who I am? James, my baby? But you're so grown up? Where's your father? Where's Harold? Harold had been dead for 10 years. I wasn't buying it. 5 minutes ago, she'd been arguing about the money, making excuses. Now suddenly she couldn't remember her husband was dead? Barbara, stop this. James turned on me. Can't you see something's wrong with her? Something's wrong, all right. She's acting. Barbara started crying. Who is this woman? Why is she being mean to me? James rushed to comfort her while glaring at me. We need to get her to a hospital. At the ER, Barbara played confused patient perfectly. Didn't know the date, the president, couldn't count backward from 20. The doctor ordered tests, MRI, blood work, cognitive assessments. Early-stage dementia is possible, the doctor told us, though the onset seems sudden. Has she shown any symptoms before? No, I said, the same time James said, maybe. He looked at me desperately. Remember last month? She called me Steve twice. Steve was his brother. That was after wine at dinner. The test came back inconclusive. Sometimes early Alzheimer's doesn't show clearly on scans, the doctor explained. We'll need to monitor her. Barbara moved in with us that night. James insisted she couldn't be alone. For 2 weeks, she kept up the act. Wandering the house at night, calling me by his ex-girlfriend's name, forgetting she'd eaten and demanding second dinners. But I noticed things. She only forgot things that were convenient. Never forgot her soap opera schedule. Never forgot where she hid her cigarettes. Only forgot the stealing, the lies, the money. I installed cameras without telling James. Barbara would shuffle confused past him, then walk normally when alone. She'd cry about not remembering our wedding, then accurately text her sister about everything happening in our house. The breaking point came when I overheard her on the phone. Working perfectly. James believes everything. That bitch wife of his can't prove anything now. Who's going to prosecute a sick old lady? I recorded everything. That evening at dinner, Barbara started her routine. Is this my house? It's so lovely. Cut the act, I said. What act? James snapped. She's sick. I pulled out my phone and played the recording. Barbara's voice filled the room. That bitch wife of his can't prove anything now. James's fork clattered to his plate. Barbara's confused expression vanished, replaced with cold calculation. That's not me, she said. It's literally your voice, Barbara. It's AI, deepfake. You can do anything with technology now. She turned to James with tears. She's trying to frame me because she wants me out. Mom, that's clearly you. Barbara clutched her chest. Oh God, my heart! She collapsed, gasping. James called 911. Again. At the hospital, our third visit, the same doctor looked suspicious. Another episode? While Barbara was getting an EKG, I showed the doctor my recordings. Her wandering normally, texting clearly, the phone call. He watched with growing anger. This is medical fraud, he said quietly. We've run thousands of dollars in tests. What can we do? I'm ordering a psychiatric evaluation, not optional. The psychiatrist saw through Barbara immediately. Malingering, she told us privately. Faking illness for personal gain. I've seen it before, but rarely this elaborate. Barbara was discharged with a clean bill of health and a note in her file about fraudulent behavior. In the parking garage, she dropped all pretense. So what? You proved I don't have Alzheimer's. I still don't remember taking your money. We have security footage of you at the ATM, I said. Prove it was intentional. Maybe I thought it was my account. Maybe I was confused. Temporary confusion isn't illegal. James finally spoke. You betrayed us. You stole from us. Then you used Grandma's disease to manipulate me. I did what I had to do. You never visit, never call. I needed attention. You needed $47,000 worth of attention? Barbara shrugged. I have a gambling problem. There, happy? I admitted it. It's a disease too. Are you going to prosecute a sick old lady? That's when I noticed something in her purse. Prescription bottles. Lots of them. What are those? She clutched her purse closer. My medications. For what? You're perfectly healthy. James grabbed the purse. Inside were dozens of pill bottles, all different names. different doctors. Mom, these prescriptions are all different people's names. Barbara went pale. I can explain. I looked closer. The names were all variations. Barbara Johnson, Barbara Johansson, Barbara Johns, Barb Johnson. You're doctor shopping. Insurance fraud on top of everything else? James's phone rang. He answered, face going white. That was my Aunt Carol. She said you called asking to borrow money because I refused to pay for your Alzheimer's treatment. You told her I abandoned you. Barbara smiled coldly. She's sending a check tomorrow. I grabbed my phone and hit Aunt Carol's number before Barbara could take another step toward the parking garage exit. The phone rang twice while James stared at the pill bottles in his hands, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. I hit speaker just as Carol's voice came through, bright and cheerful. She was excited, talking about how she'd already addressed the envelope and was planning to drop it at the post office tomorrow morning. My stomach twisted hearing how happy she sounded to help. I cut her off and started talking fast, explaining everything. The $47,000 Barbara stole from us over 3 years. The fake Alzheimer's act that fooled the ER doctors. The surveillance footage I'd collected showing her walking normally when she thought no one was watching. The recorded phone call where she bragged about the con. And now, the prescription bottles we'd just found. Dozens of them in different name variations. Proof she was running some kind of drug fraud scheme on top of everything else. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Carol's voice came back, completely different. All the warmth was gone, replaced by something cold and sharp. She asked Barbara directly if what I was saying was true. Barbara's confident smirk vanished. Her face went pale, then red, and she opened her mouth but nothing came out at first. She tried to recover, claiming I was making things up because I wanted her out of our lives. She said I was exaggerating, that she was confused about some things but not a criminal. Carol cut her off mid-sentence. Her voice was steady and hard as she said she'd been getting calls from Barbara for years. Emergency car repairs that cost exactly $800. Medical bills that needed immediate payment. House repairs that couldn't wait. She'd sent money every time because that's what sisters do. But now she was seeing the pattern clearly, all those emergencies that never quite added up, all those crises that seemed to happen right when Barbara needed cash. She told Barbara she was done enabling this behavior. James took the phone from me with shaking hands. He could barely get words out at first, his voice cracking as he said Carol's name. She immediately softened, telling him this wasn't his fault, and she was sorry she hadn't seen through Barbara's manipulation sooner. She offered to write down every time Barbara had asked her for money, going back as far as she could remember. She said she still had some of the texts and emails where Barbara explained her various emergencies. James thanked her, then ended the call because he looked like he might cry. We sat in the car for a long moment, engine off, Barbara standing outside the passenger window looking furious. James's hands wouldn't stop shaking as he picked up the pill bottles one by one, reading the names. Barbara Johnson, Barbara Johansson, Barbara Johns, Barb Johnson, B.B. Johnson, Barbara Jada Johnston. He counted 8 different variations, all with different prescription numbers, different doctors listed, different pharmacies. I watched his face as he processed what his mother had been doing, the scale of her crimes expanding beyond what we'd known an hour ago. I suggested we drive straight to the police station. James nodded slowly, not looking at me, still staring at the pills. He rolled down the window and told his mother she had 2 choices. She could get in the car voluntarily and come with us to report everything, or we'd call the police and have them pick her up. Either way, this was ending tonight. Barbara stood there for maybe 30 seconds, and I could see her running calculations behind her eyes. She was trying to figure out if she could talk her way out of this, if there was some angle she hadn't played yet. But Carol's rejection had broken something in her strategy. She'd been counting on that check, counting on having family she could manipulate for money. Now that safety net was gone. She opened the back door and got in without saying a word. The drive to the police station took 15 minutes. Barbara sat directly behind James, and I kept checking the rearview mirror to make sure she wasn't trying anything. She wasn't crying or pretending to be confused anymore. She just sat there sighing occasionally, these angry huffing sounds like she was the victim of some great injustice. No apologies, no remorse, just irritation that her con had finally collapsed. The police station lobby was mostly empty when we walked in. A tired-looking officer at the front desk asked how he could help, and I said we needed to report theft and prescription fraud. He picked up a phone, spoke quietly to someone, then told us to wait. 10 minutes later, Detective Rupert Cooley came out to meet us. He was maybe 50, with gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too many bad situations to be surprised by much. He led us to a small interview room with a table and 4 chairs. James carefully laid out all the pill bottles on the table while I explained what we'd discovered. The detective picked up each bottle, examining the labels closely, taking notes. He explained that doctor shopping and prescription fraud were serious crimes, completely separate from the theft charges. Pharmacies had systems that tracked patients filling prescriptions at multiple locations, and insurance companies investigated patterns of suspicious activity. Barbara sat stone-faced through most of the interview, arms crossed, staring at the wall above the detective's head. But when Cooley mentioned the pharmacy tracking systems, something changed in her expression. She looked surprised, maybe even shocked that there was actual technology monitoring this kind of fraud. She'd thought she was being clever with the name variations, but she hadn't counted on computers flagging the patterns. Detective Cooley turned his attention from the pill bottles to Barbara and asked her directly about the prescriptions. She straightened in her chair and explained that she had legitimate pain issues from an old car accident, and different doctors had prescribed medications to help manage her symptoms. Her voice sounded calm and reasonable, like she'd been practicing this explanation. The detective nodded slowly and picked up 3 of the bottles, examining the dates on the labels. He pointed out that 2 prescriptions for the exact same medication were filled on the same day at pharmacies only 5 miles apart, both under slightly different versions of her name. Barbara's mouth opened, but no words came out. Cooley continued, noting that insurance records showed overlapping prescriptions for identical medications across a 6-month period, which wasn't consistent with legitimate pain management from multiple doctors who would coordinate treatment. Barbara's confident expression crumbled, and she looked down at the table without saying anything more. James and I exchanged glances while the detective made notes on his pad. I pulled out my phone and showed Cooley the video footage I'd captured of Barbara walking normally. When she thought no one was watching, the recordings of her texting clearly about our household and the phone call where she admitted her whole act was working perfectly. James added the bank statements showing the systematic withdrawals over 3 years, each one carefully timed when we were both at work. We laid out the receipts from casinos that matched dates when money disappeared from our account. The detective examined everything methodically, occasionally asking questions about specific transactions or dates. He explained that he would need to coordinate with insurance fraud investigators because the prescription scheme involved filing false claims across multiple providers. The scope of Barbara's fraud extended beyond just stealing from us. Cooley mentioned that insurance fraud investigators had specialized tools for tracking prescription patterns and identifying doctor shopping operations. James asked how long the investigation would take, and the detective gave us an honest answer that made my stomach sink. Financial crimes moved slowly through the system, he explained, because investigators needed to gather records from multiple banks, insurance companies, pharmacies, and medical offices. The process could take weeks or even months before charges were formally filed. He assured us that Barbara's behavior was well documented now and the evidence was strong, but the legal system had its own timeline that we couldn't rush. I felt frustrated knowing Barbara might be walking around free for months while investigators built their case, but Cooley reminded us that thorough investigation meant stronger prosecution later. He told Barbara she was free to leave, but warned her not to leave the state while the investigation was ongoing. She would need to stay available for additional questioning, and any attempts to flee would result in immediate arrest. Barbara stood up slowly and turned to James, asking if he would give her a ride home. The look on James's face broke something inside me, even though I knew she deserved his rejection. His expression showed pure disgust mixed with grief, like he was seeing his mother clearly for the first time and hating what he saw. He told her no in a flat voice that left no room for argument. Barbara's face tightened, but she didn't argue or try to manipulate him with tears this time. We followed her out to the station lobby and watched as she pulled out her phone to call a taxi. She stood by the window looking out at the parking lot, and I noticed how different she appeared now. No confused shuffling or trembling hands, no fearful glances around like she didn't know where she was. She just looked calculating and angry, probably running through her options and realizing how thoroughly her con had fallen apart. The taxi arrived within 10 minutes and we watched her get in without looking back at us. James stood frozen until the cab disappeared around the corner. We drove home in silence. James gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white, but he didn't say anything until we pulled into our driveway. That night at home, James broke down crying for the first time since this whole nightmare started. He sat on our couch with his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. I sat down next to him and put my arm around his shoulders. He wasn't crying for his mother, he told me between gasps. He was grieving the parent he thought he had versus who she actually was. All those years he'd believed she was just struggling financially, that she needed help because life was hard for her. Now he understood she'd been systematically stealing from us, lying to everyone, running fraud schemes while playing the victim. I held him while he processed everything, letting him cry without trying to make it better with empty words. He kept saying he should have believed me from the start, that he should have seen through her act immediately. I reminded him that Barbara had deliberately manipulated his trauma about his grandmother dying from Alzheimer's. She knew his greatest fear and weaponized it against him in the cruelest way possible. That kind of calculated psychological abuse wasn't something he should blame himself for falling victim to. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee. Carol's name appeared on the screen and I answered quickly, putting her on speaker so James could hear. She said she'd spent the previous evening going through her records and email history, creating a detailed list of every time Barbara had requested money over the past 7 years. The total came to over $30,000, which made both James and I freeze in shock. Carol explained that Barbara always had emergencies that needed immediate financial help. Her car would break down right before an important appointment. She'd have unexpected medical bills her insurance didn't cover, Her house would need urgent repairs that couldn't wait. Carol had felt obligated to help her sister each time, believing the crises were genuine bad luck. Now she realized most of it was probably gambling losses that Barbara needed to cover before anyone noticed. We thanked Carol for documenting everything and for her willingness to help with the investigation. She apologized for almost sending that check before calling us first to verify Barbara's story. She told us she was closing her bank account that afternoon and opening a new one at a different bank, so Barbara couldn't try to forge any checks using old account information. James spent the rest of that day on the phone, calling every family member whose number he had saved. His uncle picked up first, and I watched James's face change as he explained everything about Barbara's theft, her fake Alzheimer's act, the prescription fraud we'd discovered. His uncle went quiet for a long time before admitting he wasn't totally surprised. Barbara had borrowed money from him twice last year for what she called emergencies, and both times something about her story felt off. James hung up looking sick. His aunt was next, then his cousins, then distant relatives he hadn't talked to in years. Most reacted with shock, asking how this could happen, but a few admitted they'd suspected something wasn't right about Barbara's constant financial problems. One cousin said Barbara always seemed to have money for casino trips but never enough for basic bills. Another mentioned that Barbara had asked to use their address for mail delivery once, which seemed weird at the time. James made notes of everything people told him, creating a pattern that stretched back years. His cousin mentioned something that made James freeze mid-conversation. Barbara had asked to borrow his credit card about 6 months ago, claiming she needed groceries because her own card wasn't working. The cousin had refused because something felt wrong about the request, the way Barbara got defensive when he suggested just giving her cash instead. James thanked him and hung up, then sat staring at his phone. He realized Barbara had been trying to scam people across the entire family for years, testing different approaches to see what worked. Some people gave her money out of guilt or obligation. Others refused and probably got labeled as selfish or uncaring. We'd just been her biggest success story because we had joint accounts she could access and a son she could manipulate. 3 days passed with no word from Barbara. We changed all our passwords, closed old accounts, opened new ones at a different bank. Detective Cooley called on Wednesday morning while I was making breakfast. He said an insurance investigator named Rosanna Velasquez wanted to meet with us because the prescription fraud case was bigger than he initially thought. We drove to the police station that afternoon and met Rosanna in a conference room filled with file folders and printouts. She looked tired but focused, spreading documents across the table that showed prescription claims filed under variations of Barbara's name. Barbara Johnson, Barbara Johansson, Barbara Johns, Barb Johnson, B.T. Johnson. Different birth dates that were all close to her real age. Different addresses across 3 counties. Different insurance providers that apparently didn't cross-reference claims between companies. Rosanna explained that Barbara had been filing insurance claims for expensive medications under these multiple identities, then selling the pills. The fraud totaled over $15,000 in false claims paid out by insurance companies over the past 2 years. She had prescriptions for pain medications, anxiety medications, sleep aids, all the drugs that had street value. Barbara would see different doctors in different cities, get prescriptions filled at different pharmacies, submit claims to different insurance providers, then sell the medications to buyers Rosanna was still trying to identify. The system was supposed to catch this kind of pattern, but Barbara had been careful about spacing out her claims and using variations of her information that didn't trigger automatic flags. I felt sick listening to Rosanna lay out the details. Barbara wasn't just gambling away money she stole from us. She was running an organized prescription resale operation, committing insurance fraud on a scale I couldn't comprehend. This was way more serious than I understood when we found those pill bottles in her purse. This wasn't desperate behavior or addiction making bad choices. This was calculated criminal enterprise, planned and executed over years. Rosanna showed us spreadsheets tracking Barbara's prescription fills across multiple pharmacies. The dates, the medications, the insurance claims, all documented in neat rows that proved systematic fraud. Barbara had been doing this while living in our house, while pretending to have Alzheimer's, while crying about being a sick old lady who needed help. Rosanna said Barbara's pattern matched known prescription fraud rings that operated in the area, though Barbara appeared to be working independently rather than as part of an organized group. That somehow made it worse, knowing she'd figured this out on her own. The insurance companies were pursuing both criminal charges and civil recovery of the money she'd stolen through false claims. Combined with the theft charges Detective Cooley was building, Barbara was facing serious prison time if convicted on everything. Rosanna asked if we had any information about who Barbara might have been selling medications to, but we didn't. We barely knew our own mother anymore, let alone her criminal contacts. James asked the question I'd been afraid to voice. Would we ever get our $47,000 back? Rosanna looked at him with something like sympathy, and told us honestly that restitution in fraud cases was complicated. Courts could order Barbara to pay us back, but actually collecting that money was different. Barbara likely spent or gambled most of it away already. Even if she went to jail, she'd have no income to make restitution payments. We might get small amounts over years, or we might get nothing. The criminal case was about punishment and preventing future crimes, not about making us whole financially. That answer hurt more than I expected, even though I'd already suspected it was true. We met with an attorney named Alistair Jennings the following week. Detective Cooley had recommended him as someone who specialized in family financial crimes and elder fraud cases. Alistair's office was small but organized, with file cabinets labeled by year and legal books lining the walls. He reviewed everything we brought, reading through bank statements, watching the video footage, examining the prescription bottles we'd photographed. He explained our options for civil suits separate from the criminal case. We could sue Barbara for the money she stole, get a judgment against her, but collecting on that judgment would be difficult. Civil suits took time and money for legal fees, and we'd be chasing someone who probably had no assets worth seizing. Alistair told us that even if Barbara went to jail, collecting money from her would be nearly impossible if she had no assets. His recommendation was to focus on preventing future theft and protecting ourselves legally, rather than spending years trying to recover money that probably didn't exist anymore. We could put fraud alerts on our credit, freeze our accounts, monitor everything Barbara might try to access. We could get restraining orders to keep her away from us. We could testify in the criminal case to make sure she faced consequences. But getting our $47,000 back was unlikely unless Barbara had hidden assets we didn't know about. I asked about Barbara's house, the small place she'd owned for 20 years. Alistair said we could potentially place a lien on it as part of restitution if the court ordered repayment. But that process took time, required going through proper legal channels, and Barbara might try to sell the house or transfer ownership to someone else before we could secure the lien. He'd seen cases where defendants sold or gave away assets to family members right before judgments came through, making themselves judgment-proof. We'd need to act fast if we wanted any chance of recovering money through her property. Alistair said he could file the paperwork to start that process, but it would cost legal fees and might not succeed. James and I looked at each other across Alistair's desk, both thinking the same thing. We were throwing good money after bad, spending more to chase money we'd probably never see again, but doing nothing felt like letting Barbara win completely. I decided we needed to get that restraining order filed before Barbara tried something else. James sat at our kitchen table staring at his phone for 20 minutes before he finally nodded and said we should call Alistair. His voice sounded flat when he made the call, like he was reading from a script he didn't want to perform. Alistair answered on the second ring and said he could meet us that afternoon at his office. We drove there in silence except for the GPS directions. James's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles went white. At Alistair's office, we sat across from his desk while he pulled up a restraining order template on his computer. He asked us to list every reason we needed protection from Barbara. I started with the theft, then the fake Alzheimer's act, then the prescription fraud. James added the manipulation about his grandmother's disease. Alistair typed everything, his fingers moving fast across the keyboard. He asked if Barbara had made any threats. I remembered her cold smile in the parking garage when she said Carol was sending a check. That counted as ongoing fraud attempts. Alistair printed 3 copies of the petition and showed us where to sign. James's hand shook when he picked up the pen. He stared at the signature line for almost a minute before he finally wrote his name. I signed next to him. Alistair said he'd file it with the court that day, and we'd get a hearing date within 2 weeks. The waiting felt terrible. Every time my phone rang, I jumped thinking it might be Barbara trying to contact us. James barely slept. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning and find him sitting in the living room in the dark, just staring at nothing. He didn't want to talk about it. When I tried to bring it up, he'd just shake his head and say he was fine. 2 weeks later, we got the notice. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9. We had to be there to present our case. Barbara would be there too. That night, James threw up twice. He kept saying he couldn't believe he was taking his own mother to court. I reminded him she'd stolen from us, lied to us, used his worst fear against him. He knew all that. Knowing didn't make it easier. Thursday morning arrived cold and gray. We dressed in business clothes like Alistair told us to. Professional appearance mattered, he'd said. James wore a suit I'd only seen him wear to funerals. We got to the courthouse 40 minutes early and sat on a bench outside the courtroom. Other people walked past us, lawyers in expensive suits, families who looked as stressed as we felt. At 8:50, Barbara showed up. She had a public defender with her, a young guy who looked maybe 2 years out of law school. He carried a thin folder that couldn't have had much in it. Barbara saw us and her face did this weird thing where she looked sad and angry at the same time. She didn't try to come over. The public defender kept glancing at his folder like he was trying to memorize whatever was in there. The bailiff called us in at 9 sharp. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, not like the ones on TV. The judge was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tight. She told us to approach the bench. Alistair presented our petition and the evidence we'd compiled. Bank statements showing the withdrawals, the video footage from our home cameras, the recorded phone call, the prescription bottles we'd photographed. The public defender tried to argue that Barbara had mental health issues, and gambling addiction wasn't her fault. Alistair countered that mental health problems didn't excuse fraud and theft. The judge listened to everything without much expression on her face. She asked Barbara directly if she'd taken money from us. Barbara said yes, but she had a problem and needed help. The judge asked if she'd faked Alzheimer's disease. Barbara started to say something about being confused, then stopped. The judge granted a temporary restraining order right there. Barbara couldn't contact us, couldn't come within 500 feet of our house or our workplaces. The judge scheduled a full hearing for next month to make it permanent. Barbara's face went red. She glared at us from across the courtroom, but the bailiff was standing right there, so she didn't move. We left through the side door. James cried in the car. Not loud sobbing, just quiet tears running down his face while he drove. I didn't know what to say. We'd won, but it didn't feel like winning. When we got home, I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table not drinking it. James finally said he thought we should see a counselor together. He couldn't trust his own judgment anymore. Barbara had played him so completely that he didn't know how to believe anything. I agreed immediately. We needed help working through this mess. I found a therapist who specialized in family trauma and financial abuse. Her name was Dr. Johns, and she had an opening the following week. We took it. The first session was awkward. Dr. Johns asked us to explain what brought us in. James struggled to get the words out. I ended up telling most of the story while he sat there looking at his hands. Dr. Johns listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she asked James how he felt about what happened. He said he felt stupid for believing his mother. Dr. Johns stopped him there. She explained that Barbara's manipulation was sophisticated and deliberately targeted his greatest fear. She'd weaponized his trauma about his grandmother dying of Alzheimer's. That wasn't something a normal person would defend against because normal people don't expect their parents to fake terminal illnesses. James wasn't stupid. He was being psychologically abused by someone who knew exactly which buttons to push. That made him start crying again. Dr. Johns handed him tissues and said recognizing the abuse was the first step to healing from it. Over the next few sessions, Dr. Johns helped James understand that Barbara had spent years learning how to manipulate him. She knew his fears, his guilt, his sense of family obligation. She'd used all of it against him with practiced skill. The fake Alzheimer's wasn't random. It was calculated psychological warfare. Dr. Johns said abusers often target their victims' deepest vulnerabilities because that's where they're most defenseless. James had been defending himself against a mother who needed help, not a con artist who was attacking him. Those are completely different situations requiring different responses. I worked through my own anger in those sessions too. I'd been furious that James didn't believe me at first. Dr. Johns helped me see that Barbara's goal was to divide us, make James choose between his wife and his mother, make me the villain who was attacking a sick old lady. If we'd split up over it, Barbara would have won completely. The fact that we were sitting in therapy together meant we weren't letting her succeed. That shifted something in my head. My anger at James started feeling less important than our shared anger at what Barbara had done to both of us. 4 weeks after we first went to the police, Detective Cooley called my cell phone. I was at work, so I stepped outside to take it. He said the district attorney was filing charges against Barbara. Multiple charges: theft over $10,000, insurance fraud, prescription fraud, identity fraud. I asked what that meant for sentencing. He said if convicted on all counts, she could face up to 8 years in prison. The number shocked me. I'd been thinking maybe probation, community service, something like that. 8 years was serious time. I thanked him and hung up. Then I called James at his office and told him. He went quiet for a long time. Finally, he asked if I thought she'd actually go to jail. I said I didn't know, but she'd done this to herself. Every choice that led to this point was hers. James struggled with the idea of his mother in prison. He talked about it constantly in therapy. Dr. Johns kept reminding him that consequences for actions aren't punishment, they're reality. Barbara stole, lied, defrauded insurance companies, and faked illnesses. Those actions have legal consequences. James wanting to protect her from those consequences was understandable, but it didn't change what she'd done. He knew that intellectually. Emotionally was harder. Barbara's arraignment happened fast. We got notice it was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Alistair said we didn't have to attend, but we might want to see what happened. We went. Barbara stood in front of the judge in an orange jumpsuit looking small and old. The judge read the charges: insurance fraud, prescription fraud, identity fraud, 4 separate counts. Barbara pleaded not guilty to everything. Her public defender argued she had mental health issues that contributed to her behavior. Gambling addiction was a disease. She needed treatment, not prison. The prosecutor, a woman named Gomez, said mental health issues didn't excuse systematic fraud over multiple years. Barbara had been competent enough to create multiple false identities and run a prescription resale operation. That showed planning and intent. The judge set bail at $50,000. Barbara couldn't pay it. She'd be staying in jail until trial. After the arraignment, Alistair pulled us aside in the hallway. He warned us that Barbara might try the diminished capacity defense at trial. Claim gambling addiction or other mental health problems made her not responsible for her actions. It rarely worked, but defendants tried it anyway. Juries didn't usually buy it when someone had been functional enough to commit complex fraud. But we should be prepared for Barbara's lawyer to paint her as a victim of her own compulsions. I asked what we could do about that. Alistair said we'd testify about her calculated manipulation, the fake Alzheimer's act, how she deliberately targeted James's trauma. That would show the jury she was in complete control of her actions and knew exactly what she was doing. The prosecutor's office called 2 days after the arraignment to schedule our meeting. Gomez wanted to go over everything before trial prep officially started. We drove downtown on a Thursday morning and took the elevator to the 7th floor where her office sat at the end of a long hallway, lined with case files stacked on metal carts. She shook our hands and gestured to chairs across from her desk that was buried under folders and legal pads covered in notes. Gomez looked tired but sharp, the kind of person who'd seen every trick and wasn't impressed by any of them. She pulled out a thick file with Barbara's name on it and started flipping through pages while explaining what came next. The trial wouldn't happen for at least 6 months, maybe longer depending on court schedules and defense delays. Barbara's public defender would file motions, request continuances, try to drag things out hoping we'd give up or settle. Gomez had handled elder fraud cases before and knew the pattern. Defendants banked on victims getting exhausted by the legal process and dropping charges. She told us not to let that happen. We needed to stay committed through all the waiting and paperwork and frustrating delays. James asked if she thought we'd win, and Gomez said the evidence was strong, but juries were unpredictable, especially with older defendants who looked sympathetic. Barbara would probably cry on the stand, and her lawyer would paint her as a confused old woman with addiction problems who made mistakes. Our job was to show the jury how calculated and deliberate her actions were over 3 years. The fake Alzheimer's Act would help prove that. Gomez made notes while we talked, circling things in red pen and writing reminders in the margins. She asked detailed questions about the timeline, the amounts stolen, how we discovered the theft. Everything needed to be documented precisely because defense lawyers attacked any inconsistency. After an hour, she walked us out and promised to keep us updated on court dates and developments. Our bank appointment happened that afternoon. We'd called ahead to explain the situation, and the manager had everything ready when we arrived. She led us to a private office and pulled up our account information on her computer screen. Barbara's name was listed as an authorized user on our checking account from 3 years ago, when James added her during a medical emergency. That authorization let her access everything. The manager started the process to remove Barbara and freeze the accounts immediately. We'd need new account numbers, new debit cards, new checks. She recommended opening accounts at a completely different bank just to be safe since Barbara knew all our information at this branch. We spent 2 hours filling out forms and transferring automatic payments to temporary accounts. The manager set up fraud alerts on everything and gave us a packet about identity theft protection. She mentioned that elder financial abuse was becoming more common, and banks were training staff to spot warning signs. I wondered how many families went through this same process in this same office. James looked exhausted, signing form after form, his signature getting sloppier with each page. That night, I logged into the credit monitoring service we'd signed up for and pulled both our credit reports. Mine looked normal, but James's had a red flag. An application for a credit card had been submitted 2 months ago in his name at an address we didn't recognize. The application was denied due to insufficient income listed, which made no sense because James made good money. I clicked through to see the details and my stomach dropped. The income listed was $20,000 and the employment was blank. Someone had filled out the application wrong on purpose or didn't know James's actual information. The address was a P.O. box in the next county. I called James over and showed him the screen. His face went gray as he read through the application details. Barbara had tried to open credit in his name and failed, but the attempt was still there in his credit history. He grabbed his phone and started searching for the P.O. box address. It came back to a mail forwarding service that rented boxes by the month. Barbara must have set it up specifically to receive the credit card without us knowing. We filed a police report online that night using the city's fraud reporting system. Detective Cooley called us the next morning after seeing the report come through. He asked us to email him screenshots of the credit report and any documentation we had. I sent everything while James sat next to me looking sick. Cooley said this showed escalation in Barbara's criminal behavior. She wasn't just stealing money we had, she was trying to create new credit lines to steal from. The identity theft attempt would be added to her case file and could result in additional charges. James barely spoke after hanging up. He stared at his laptop screen showing the credit report with that failed application highlighted in red. His mother had tried to steal his identity 2 months ago while living in our house and eating our food and pretending to have Alzheimer's. The betrayal kept getting deeper every time we uncovered something new. Carol called 3 days later sounding upset. Barbara had contacted her from a phone number Carol didn't recognize. She'd been crying and begging for money to hire a better lawyer than the public defender. Carol said she almost believed her until Barbara claimed we were exaggerating everything and being vindictive because we never liked her. That's when Carol knew it was more manipulation. She'd recorded the entire call on her phone and wanted to send it to Detective Cooley. I told her that would help and asked her to email it to us too. The recording arrived an hour later and I listened to it twice. Barbara's voice sounded desperate and scared, nothing like the cold woman in the parking garage. She admitted she was in trouble, but kept saying we were making it worse than it was. Carol stayed firm through the whole conversation, telling Barbara she needed to face consequences for once in her life instead of running from them. Barbara started crying harder and hung up. James's uncle called that weekend. We barely knew him since he lived across the country and only visited every few years. He'd heard about Barbara's arrest from Carol and wanted to tell us something he'd never reported. 5 years ago, Barbara visited his house for a week, and several pieces of his wife's jewelry went missing after she left. They suspected her but didn't want to cause family drama, so they never said anything. He'd found pawnshop receipts later that confirmed his suspicions. The jewelry was worth about $3,000. He offered to testify if it would help our case. James thanked him and took down all the details. After hanging up, he looked at me and said he was starting to wonder how many people Barbara had stolen from over the years. How many family members stayed quiet to avoid drama while she kept stealing? Gomez called to update us on the case she was building. Between Carol's documentation, James's uncle's testimony, and evidence from other family members coming forward, she could show a pattern of theft and fraud going back over a decade. Each new person who contacted her added weight to the criminal charges. Barbara wasn't a confused old lady who made mistakes. She was a career criminal who'd been stealing from family for years and finally got caught. The pattern evidence would make it much harder for the defense to claim diminished capacity or temporary confusion. Gomez sounded satisfied with how the case was developing. 2 months after that parking garage confrontation, Alistair called with unexpected news. Barbara's public defender had approached him about a plea deal. She was willing to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for avoiding trial. The offer was on the table for 72 hours before it expired. Alistair said we should meet to discuss it before making any decisions. We drove to his office that afternoon and he laid out the terms. Barbara would plead guilty to theft and fraud charges. The prosecution would drop the identity theft charge and some of the prescription fraud counts. In exchange, she'd be sentenced to 5 years probation with suspended prison time. If she violated probation, she'd serve 2 years. The deal included mandatory restitution payments of $500 per month until the full $47,000 was repaid, plus mandatory gambling addiction treatment and random drug testing. James asked what happened if we said no and pushed for trial. Alistair explained that trials were risky and unpredictable. Juries might sympathize with Barbara despite the evidence. A trial could take a year or more to actually happen, and there was no guarantee of conviction. The plea deal guaranteed she'd have a criminal record and legal obligation to pay us back. It wasn't perfect, but it was certain. I wanted Barbara in jail, but I understood the logic. A guaranteed guilty plea with restitution was better than risking a trial we might lose. James sat quietly processing everything. Finally, he said he'd agree to the plea deal with one condition. Barbara had to admit in open court exactly what she did with no vague statements or excuses. Alistair said he could make that a requirement of the plea agreement. Gomez would insist on a full allocution where Barbara stated her crimes clearly for the record. We drove home in silence that night. James kept his eyes on the road while I stared out the window. My phone buzzed with a text from Alistair asking if we'd had time to think about the plea deal. I didn't answer yet because I wasn't sure what to tell him. Part of me wanted Barbara behind bars where she belonged. She'd stolen from us, lied to us, manipulated James's worst fear about his grandmother's disease. The fake Alzheimer's act alone deserved prison time in my mind. But Alistair's words kept running through my head about how trials worked. Juries could be unpredictable. Financial crimes were hard to prove beyond reasonable doubt even with all our evidence. Barbara's lawyer might find some way to make her look sympathetic. The gambling addiction angle could work in her favor if they played it right. A trial could drag on for over a year while we paid legal fees and relived the trauma every time we had to appear in court. The plea deal guaranteed she'd have a criminal record. It guaranteed restitution payments even if they'd take years to complete. It guaranteed consequences without the risk of losing at trial. James pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine. He sat there gripping the steering wheel for a long moment before speaking. He said he didn't know what to do. His voice sounded tired and defeated in a way I'd never heard before. I reached over and put my hand on his arm. We needed to talk about this seriously before giving Alistair an answer. Inside the house, we sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee neither of us actually drank. I laid out my thoughts about wanting Barbara in jail but understanding the risks. James listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said he'd been thinking the same things. He wanted his mother punished for what she'd done to us and to his memory of his grandmother. But he also wanted this to be over. The stress of the last few months had taken a toll on both of us. Our marriage had nearly broken under the pressure of Barbara's manipulation. We'd spent thousands on legal fees already, and a trial would cost even more. The plea deal offered certainty even if it wasn't perfect justice. I asked him what his gut said. He looked down at his coffee cup and said he thought we should accept the plea but only with conditions. He wanted Barbara to admit in court exactly what she'd done. No vague statements about making mistakes or having problems. She needed to say out loud that she stole $47,000 from us, that she faked Alzheimer's disease, that she ran prescription fraud schemes. James said hearing her take responsibility without excuses might give us the closure we needed more than seeing her in an orange jumpsuit. I understood what he meant. Part of what made this so hard was that Barbara had never truly admitted fault. Even when caught, she'd tried to spin it or minimize it or blame her gambling addiction. Making her stand in court and own her actions completely felt important somehow. I texted Alistair back saying we'd accept the plea deal if the prosecutor agreed to require a full admission from Barbara. No wiggle room, no vague language. She had to state clearly what crimes she committed against us. The next morning, we met with the prosecutor at her office downtown. Her name was printed on the door, but I'd started thinking of her simply as the prosecutor since we'd worked with her for weeks now. She had a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated after dealing with Barbara's constant lies. We sat across from her desk while she reviewed the plea agreement paperwork. She said the deal was fair given the circumstances. Financial crime trials were notoriously difficult to win because jurors often sympathized with defendants who claimed confusion or addiction or mental health issues. The evidence against Barbara was strong, but not airtight. A good defense attorney could create reasonable doubt by arguing Barbara had genuinely believed the money was hers to use or that her gambling addiction constituted a mental impairment. The plea deal avoided those risks entirely. Barbara would have a criminal record that would follow her forever. She'd be legally obligated to pay restitution at $500 monthly, which would take years, but guaranteed we'd eventually recover our money. The probation terms meant any violation would send her straight to prison for 2 years. I explained James's condition about Barbara having to admit everything in court. The prosecutor nodded and said she could absolutely require that as part of the plea agreement. She called it an allocution where the defendant had to state their crimes clearly for the court record. Barbara would have to stand before the judge and describe exactly what she'd done. The prosecutor would prepare specific questions that Barbara would have to answer honestly and completely. If Barbara tried to minimize or avoid responsibility, the judge could reject the plea and send the case to trial. That possibility would keep Barbara honest, because she knew trial meant risking much harsher consequences. James looked relieved hearing this. He signed the paperwork accepting the plea deal with the allocution requirement added. The prosecutor said she'd contact Barbara's public defender and schedule the plea hearing. It would probably happen within 3 to 4 weeks depending on the court calendar. Those 3 weeks felt strange. We knew the legal case was essentially over, but hadn't yet had the formal closure of the hearing. Barbara was still out there somewhere living her life while we waited for consequences to finally arrive. I found myself checking the court website obsessively to see if a hearing date had been posted. James threw himself into work as a distraction. We went to our counseling sessions and talked about how we'd feel once the hearing happened. Our counselor asked if we expected to feel satisfied or vindicated or relieved. I honestly didn't know. Part of me thought hearing Barbara admit her crimes would feel like victory. Another part of me thought it would just feel sad and empty, because James's relationship with his mother was destroyed regardless of what happened in court. The hearing date arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks and 2 days after we'd accepted the plea. We drove to the courthouse together in silence. Alistair met us in the hallway outside the courtroom. He looked professional in his suit and tie. He reminded us that this was just a formality at this point since Barbara had already agreed to plead guilty. The judge would ask her questions about her crimes, and she'd have to answer honestly. Then the judge would accept the plea and move straight to sentencing. The whole thing might take less than 30 minutes. We walked into the courtroom and sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table. Barbara was already there at the defense table with her public defender. She looked smaller somehow in her plain dress and minimal makeup. Nothing like the confident con artist from the parking garage or the fake confused patient from the hospital. She glanced back at us once with an unreadable expression, then faced forward. The judge entered and everyone stood. The bailiff called the case number and Barbara's name. Her public defender stood and confirmed they were ready to proceed with the plea agreement. The prosecutor stood and outlined the charges Barbara was pleading guilty to. Theft in the second degree, insurance fraud, prescription fraud, identity fraud. Each charge carried potential prison time if Barbara violated her probation terms. The judge asked Barbara to stand. She rose slowly and clasped her hands in front of her. The judge asked if she understood she was giving up her right to a trial by pleading guilty. Barbara said yes in a quiet voice. The judge asked if anyone had threatened or coerced her into accepting this plea deal. Barbara said no. Then the judge began the allocution. She asked Barbara to describe in her own words what she had done to warrant these criminal charges. Barbara took a breath and started talking. She said she stole $47,000 from her son and daughter-in-law over a period of 3 years. She accessed their bank accounts without permission and transferred money to herself. She used the money primarily for gambling. When confronted with evidence of the theft, she pretended to have Alzheimer's disease to avoid consequences. She deliberately manipulated her son's fear about his grandmother's illness. She faked confusion and memory loss, including during medical examinations, which constituted medical fraud. She also obtained prescription medications under multiple variations of her name from different doctors and pharmacies. She filed insurance claims for these medications, then sold them. She contacted family members and lied about being abandoned by her son in order to obtain money from them under false pretenses. Hearing her say it all out loud in that flat courtroom voice made it feel more real somehow. These weren't accusations anymore. This was Barbara's own admission of everything she'd done to us. James's hand found mine and squeezed tight. The judge asked if everything Barbara had just stated was true and accurate. Barbara said yes. The judge asked if she took full responsibility for these actions. Barbara hesitated for just a second, then said yes. The prosecutor asked if Barbara understood that her gambling addiction did not excuse or justify her criminal behavior. Barbara said she understood. The judge accepted the plea and moved immediately to sentencing. 5 years probation with suspended jail time of 2 years. If Barbara violated any term of her probation, she would serve the full 2 years in prison. Restitution payments of $500 per month beginning immediately until the full $47,000 was repaid. The judge added mandatory gambling addiction counseling with proof of attendance required monthly. Random drug testing throughout the probation period. Barbara was to have no contact with us except through official court channels regarding restitution. Any attempt to contact us directly would constitute a probation violation. The judge also added mandatory community service hours and required Barbara to maintain employment or prove she was actively seeking work. Her probation officer would verify all of this monthly. The bailiff stepped forward and handed Barbara a thick packet of papers explaining her reporting requirements. She had to check in with her probation officer within 72 hours. She had to attend her first counseling session within 1 week. She had to make her first restitution payment within 30 days. Barbara looked older and more tired as she signed paperwork, acknowledging she understood all the terms. The judge asked if she had any questions. Barbara shook her head. Court was adjourned. We stood as the judge left. Barbara's public defender gathered his files and left quickly without looking at us. Barbara stood alone at the defense table for a moment before the bailiff gestured for her to leave through the side door. She walked out without looking back at us. James let out a long breath he seemed to have been holding. Alistair came over and shook our hands. He said it went exactly as expected, and Barbara was now legally bound to all those terms. Any violation meant immediate jail time, which gave us protection. Outside the courthouse, James stopped on the steps and turned to me. He said he felt relieved it was finally over, but sad about losing his mother to her own choices. Not the mother he'd thought he had, but the real person behind the con. I held his hand and reminded him we were moving forward together. We'd gotten through the worst of it and come out stronger. The next week, Alistair helped us file a civil lien on Barbara's house. The property was worth maybe $200,000 based on recent sales in her neighborhood. The lien meant if she ever sold the house, we'd recover at least some of our money from the proceeds before she saw any profit. It wouldn't get us all $47,000 back, but it was better than nothing. Alistair explained the lien would stay attached to the property until the restitution was paid in full. If Barbara died before paying us back, the lien would be settled from her estate. It felt mercenary thinking about Barbara's death and our money, but she'd forced us into this position. A few days after that, the insurance companies reached their own settlement with Barbara. She had to pay back the $15,000 in fraudulent prescription claims. Her payment plan with them was separate from our restitution, but it meant Barbara's financial situation was completely destroyed between the two obligations. She'd be paying us and the insurance companies for years. She'd have trouble getting credit or loans with her criminal record. She'd have to report her conviction on job applications. The consequences felt appropriate for someone who'd spent years stealing and lying and manipulating everyone around her. 3 months passed since the parking garage showdown. James and I sat in our counselor's office for our weekly session, and something felt different this time. The weight that had been crushing us since Barbara's betrayal started lifting bit by bit. Our counselor asked how we'd been handling stress, and James reached over to hold my hand without prompting. We'd been doing that more lately, small touches that reminded us we were on the same team. The counseling sessions taught us how to talk about the hard stuff without attacking each other. James learned to separate his feelings about his mother from his feelings about our marriage. I learned to give him space to grieve the parent he thought he had. We practiced saying what we needed instead of expecting the other person to just know. It sounds simple, but after Barbara had spent weeks driving a wedge between us, rebuilding that trust took real work. The counselor said we were making great progress, better than most couples who go through financial betrayal by family members. The mail came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was working from home. I saw the official court envelope and my stomach dropped out of habit, but this time the contents were different. A check for $500 with Barbara's name on it, processed through the court's restitution system. I stared at it for a full minute. $500 against $47,000 stolen felt like a joke, but seeing her name on that check meant something bigger. She was paying. The system was working. Consequences were happening. I took a photo and texted it to James at work. He called immediately, and I could hear the emotion in his voice when he said it felt real now. Not the money, but the accountability. Barbara couldn't pretend anymore or manipulate her way out. Every month she'd have to write that check and remember what she did. We deposited it into our new savings account at the different bank, the one Barbara knew nothing about. It barely made a dent in what we'd lost, but starting over had to begin somewhere. Carol came over for dinner the following Saturday. She'd been doing that monthly now, bringing wine and stories about James's childhood that didn't involve Barbara. James needed those connections to his past, the good parts that Barbara's crimes had tainted. Carol told us about the summer James was 8 and spent 2 weeks at her house while Barbara and Harold went on vacation. She taught him to make pancakes, and they'd built a treehouse in her backyard that probably violated 6 different safety codes. James laughed hearing about it, really laughed, and I realized I hadn't heard that sound in months. Carol showed us photos from that summer. James grinning with missing front teeth and covered in dirt. She said he'd always been a good kid, thoughtful and kind, and Barbara's choices didn't change who he was at his core. After dinner, Carol pulled me aside while James was loading the dishwasher. She thanked me for protecting him even when it made me the bad guy. She said she should have seen Barbara's patterns years ago, but family loyalty had made her blind. I told her we were all learning to see clearly now. James came home from work on a Thursday with news that changed our immediate situation. His boss had promoted him to senior project manager with a $20,000 salary increase. He was grinning when he told me, proud of earning it through his own hard work and skill. The promotion had nothing to do with Barbara or the legal mess, just James being good at his job and his company recognizing that. We celebrated with takeout from our favorite Thai place and talked about rebuilding our savings account. The money Barbara stole had wiped out our emergency fund and derailed our plans to buy a house. This raise meant we could start working toward those goals again. James said it felt good to add money to our account instead of watching it disappear. He'd been checking our balance obsessively after discovering the theft, needing to see that the numbers were going up now through honest means. I watched him calculate how long it would take to rebuild what Barbara had destroyed, and even though the timeline stretched years ahead, having a plan gave us hope. I suggested we take a weekend trip to celebrate the promotion and reconnect away from everything that reminded us of the past few months. James agreed immediately, and we started looking at cabin rentals in the mountains. We found a place 3 hours north with hiking trails and a hot tub, available the following weekend. I booked it using some of the promotion money because we needed this, needed to remember who we were together without lawyers and court dates, and Barbara's shadow hanging over everything. Friday afternoon, we packed the car and drove north, watching the city disappear in the rearview mirror. The cabin sat nestled in pine trees with a view of the valley below. We spent 3 days hiking different trails, talking about everything and nothing, cooking simple meals together in the tiny kitchen. No phones except for emergencies, no checking email or news or court updates. Just us figuring out how to be a couple again instead of 2 people in survival mode. Saturday night in the hot tub under the stars, James said something that made me cry. He told me he was grateful I'd pushed back against Barbara's manipulation, even when he'd been angry at me for it. He said my strength in standing up to his mother helped him find his own courage to face the truth. If I'd backed down or let Barbara's fake Alzheimer's act work, they'd both still be controlling our lives through guilt and manipulation. James said watching me refuse to be gaslit taught him he could do the same, that setting boundaries with family wasn't betrayal, it was survival. I reminded him he'd made the choice to believe the evidence once he saw it clearly. Barbara had decades of practice manipulating him, using his trauma about his grandmother against him. The fact that he broke free of that pattern at all showed his own strength. We sat in the hot water holding hands and talking about how close we'd come to letting Barbara destroy our marriage along with our bank account. Sunday morning over coffee on the cabin's porch, we talked about the future in ways we hadn't been able to before. James said he wanted kids someday but needed time to heal first. He worried about being a parent when his own mother had turned out to be a con artist willing to fake dementia to avoid consequences. I told him he'd already proven he was nothing like Barbara by choosing honesty and accountability when the truth came out. We agreed we were stronger together now, that surviving this nightmare as a team meant we could handle the normal challenges of raising a family. The experience taught us how to communicate during crisis, how to support each other even when we disagreed, how to protect what we'd built together. We weren't ready for kids yet, but knowing we both wanted that future helped us see past the current mess to something better ahead. We got home Sunday evening and unpacked our bags, then went through the photos from the trip on my phone. There was one of us on a ridge overlooking the valley, James's arm around my shoulders, both of us genuinely smiling. I sent it to print and picked up the framed version 3 days later. We hung it in the living room on the wall where Barbara had performed her Oscar-worthy confused act that first night. Every time I walked past that photo now, I saw us choosing each other instead of seeing the spot where she'd tried to tear us apart. Life wasn't perfect, and we were still recovering financially, sending that $500 check to savings instead of the thousands we should have had. But we were genuinely happy in ways that had nothing to do with money. We'd built something real together based on honesty and trust, and no amount of Barbara's manipulation could take that away from us anymore.